The smoke hung thick in Berry Gordy's living room, curling around crystal chandeliers. It was late spring 1965, and Detroit's music elite had gathered in the kind of carefully orchestrated chaos that passed for celebration. Marvin stood near the far wall, a glass of something he wasn't drinking held loosely in his right hand, watching with the detached attention of someone who had learned early that the safest place at any party was the periphery. At the center of the room sat a Steinway grand piano. Behind it sat Marcus Webb, a session pianist who had played on half the hits coming out of Hitsville. His fingers moved across the keys with aggressive precision, cascading through a jazz standard that resembled a technical manual more than music. People had gathered around him, drinks held at chest level, heads nodding with practiced appreciation. Marvin had been at the party for 2 hours and had spoken perhaps 30 words total. He had performed earlier, 3 songs that Berry had requested. The performance had been competent, professional, exactly what was expected. Then he'd retreated to his current position, where he could observe without participating. Marcus finished his piece with a flourish that bordered on theatrical, hands lifting from the keys in a gesture that seemed to say, "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how it's done." The applause came immediately, sustained and enthusiastic, though Marvin noticed that several people had already begun turning back to their conversations before the last chord had fully faded. Marcus stood, accepting the praise with a smile that managed to be both gracious and self-satisfied, and surveyed the room with the confidence of someone who had just proven a point nobody had questioned. "Anyone else play?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the ambient conversation. "Any hidden virtuosos in the room tonight?" The question hung in the air for a moment, met with the kind of polite laughter that acknowledged the challenge while declining to accept it. A few people shook their heads good-naturedly. Someone made a joke about only being able to play the radio. The moment was passing, becoming just another transition in the evening's flow, when someone near Marvin, a young producer whose name he could never remember, turned and said loud enough for others to hear, "What about you, Marvin? Can you play?" Marvin felt the attention shift toward him like a physical weight, several conversations pausing mid-sentence, as people registered the question and waited for his response. He took a small sip from his glass, not because he wanted it, but because it gave him something to do with the second of silence before he answered. "A little," he said quietly, the words almost disappearing into the general noise of the room. Marcus had heard, though, and now he was looking directly at Marvin with an expression that was trying to be friendly, but carried an edge of something else underneath. Something that lived in the space between professional respect and professional territory. "A little?" Marcus repeated, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on, man. Don't be modest. If you can play, play." The invitation was not really an invitation. It was a test disguised as encouragement. The kind of social trap that Marvin had learned to recognize years ago, but had never quite learned to avoid. Declining would seem like false modesty or worse, like fear. Accepting meant walking into whatever dynamics were already at work in the room. Dynamics he didn't fully understand and couldn't control. But people were watching now, waiting, and the silence was developing the kind of weight that demanded resolution. Marvin set his glass down on a nearby table, carefully as if the physical act of releasing it required his full attention. He walked toward the piano slowly, not with hesitation, but with the measured pace of someone who was giving himself time to decide what he was about to do. The crowd had formed a tighter circle now, sensing that something interesting might be about to happen. Marcus stepped aside, gesturing toward the piano bench with an exaggerated show of generosity. "All your," he said, and in those 2 words Marvin heard the challenge made explicit. Marvin sat. The bench was still warm from Marcus's performance, and for a moment he just rested his hands in his lap, looking at the keys without touching them. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders, could sense people waiting for him to either validate their curiosity or confirm their suspicion that he'd been bluffing about being able to play. This was the trap he'd walked into 1,000 times before. The moment where proving yourself meant giving them a piece of something you wanted to keep private, and staying silent meant accepting their judgment that you had nothing worth showing. The room had gotten quieter, not silent but quieter. conversations dropping to murmurs as people turned their attention to the piano. Marvin was aware of Berry Gordy somewhere to his left, watching with the neutral expression of someone who had seen enough performances to reserve judgment until they were finished. He was aware of Smokey Robinson near the doorway, drink in hand, curious. He was aware of Diana Ross in conversation with someone across the room, only half paying attention, but paying attention nonetheless. What Marvin wanted to do was stand up and return to his spot against the wall. What he did instead was lift his hands and place them gently on the keys, fingers finding their positions without conscious thought. He didn't play jazz. He didn't play anything complicated. What he played was something simple, a melody he had been working on in his head for weeks. 4 notes, then 3, then a pause. 5 notes descending, a chord held just long enough to breathe, then the same phrase again but softer, like a question being asked with more uncertainty. The room didn't go silent immediately. Silence arrived gradually, conversation trailing off in waves as people registered that what they were hearing was different from what they had expected. Someone near the back stopped mid-sentence. A woman holding a champagne glass lowered it slowly without drinking. Berry Gordy, who had been half listening to someone's pitch about a new signing, turned his full attention to the piano. Marcus had played the piano like someone proving they could play the piano. Marvin was playing like someone trying to tell you something they couldn't say with words, and the difference was immediately, uncomfortably clear. He played for perhaps 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes at most. Nothing elaborate, nothing showy. The melody circled back on itself, variations on a theme that was barely a theme, notes hanging in the air with spaces between them that felt as important as the notes themselves. When he finished, he didn't lift his hands dramatically or turn to gauge the reaction. He simply let the final chord fade into silence, hands resting on the keys for a moment longer before returning to his lap. The applause started awkwardly, uncertain, as if people weren't sure whether what they'd heard required applause or something else entirely. But it grew, becoming genuine, and Marvin noticed something he'd never heard in applause before. It wasn't the enthusiastic clapping that follows technical brilliance or the polite acknowledgement that comes after a competent performance. It was something quieter, more thoughtful. A few people weren't even clapping, just standing still with expressions that suggested they were still processing what they'd heard. Someone in the back wiped at their eyes quickly, hoping nobody noticed. He stood, turning away from the piano, and found Marcus watching him with an expression that had lost its earlier confidence and replaced it with something harder to read. "That was," Marcus started, then stopped, searching for the right word. "That was different." Marvin nodded slightly, acknowledging the comment without quite knowing how to respond to it. Someone else in the crowd, one of the background singers whose name Marvin should have known but didn't, said, "You've been holding out on us, Marvin. How long you been playing like that?" "Long time," Marvin said quietly. "Just never had reason to mention it." Berry Gordy had moved closer now, positioning himself near the piano with the casual authority of someone whose house and party and record label this was. "You write that?" he asked. And there was genuine interest in the question, the kind of attention Berry gave when he sensed something commercially viable. "Working on it," Marvin said. "Not finished." "Well, finish it," Berry said. "That's something." The moment was ending now, people beginning to turn back to their conversations, the energy of performance dissipating into the general noise of the party. Marcus was still standing near the piano, and for a second he and Marvin made eye contact, a brief acknowledgement passing between them that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite rivalry, but lived somewhere in the complicated space between. Then Marcus smiled, a real smile this time, and said something that Marvin would remember years later when he was trying to explain to someone why he didn't like to perform. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Marcus said, keeping his voice low enough that only Marvin could hear. "I play to show people I can play. You play like you're trying to tell them something they need to hear. I've been doing this for 15 years, played on more hits than I can count, and I just realized tonight that I've never once played anything that mattered. Not the way that mattered. I don't know which one's better, but I know which one's harder." Marvin didn't respond, didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound like false modesty or genuine arrogance, both of which felt equally dishonest. He just nodded, a small acknowledgement, And then someone was pulling Marcus away to another conversation, and someone else was asking Marvin about a recording session scheduled for next week, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary flow of the evening. Later, after most guests had left, Berry found Marvin in the kitchen nursing coffee. Berry leaned against the counter, tie loosened, looking more like a regular person than the architect of an empire. "That thing you played," Berry said. "You gonna use it for something?" "Maybe," Marvin said. "I don't know yet. It's not ready." "Most things aren't ready when we release them," Berry said, which was both true and depressing in the way that most true things about the music industry were depressing. "But that's the business. We make them ready enough, and then we sell them." Marvin drank his coffee, staring at the dark liquid, like it might contain answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. "I don't think that one's for selling," he said finally. "I think that one's just for me." Berry studied him for a moment, trying to determine if this was artistic pretension or genuine feeling, and apparently deciding it didn't matter either way. "You're a strange one, Marvin," he said, not unkindly. "Most guys would kill for the attention you got in there tonight. You looked like you wanted to disappear." "I did want to disappear," Marvin admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "I always want to disappear." "Then why'd you sit down?" Marvin thought about the question, turning it over in his mind like a stone he'd found in his pocket and couldn't remember picking up. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "not playing is harder than playing. And I guess I'm tired of doing the harder thing just because it feels safer." Berry nodded as if this made perfect sense, which it probably didn't, but he was good at pretending things made sense when they served his purposes. "Well," he said, pushing off from the counter, "next time you get tired of the safer thing, do it in the studio where I can record it and make money off it." He left Marvin alone in the kitchen, and Marvin finished his coffee in the quiet that followed, thinking about the piano and the melody, and the look on Marcus's face when he'd said the thing about telling people what they needed to hear. Marvin hadn't been trying to tell anyone anything. He'd just been trying to translate a feeling that lived somewhere in his chest, right below his ribcage, in the space where guilt and longing and fear all tangled together into something he couldn't name but could sometimes, if he was lucky, turn into sound. The melody he'd played that night would eventually become part of a song, though not for several more years, and not in the form anyone at the party would have recognized. By then, Berry's living room gathering would be just another memory filed away, with hundreds of other memories of performances and parties and moments when Marvin had been asked to prove something to people who would forget about it by morning. But walking to his car that night, keys in hand, city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain, Marvin thought about Marcus's question. The difference between playing to show you can play and playing to tell someone something they need to hear. He still didn't know which one was better, but he knew with absolute certainty which one felt more like drowning and which one felt more like breathing. And he knew that rooms full of people waiting for you to impress them would always choose the drowning version because drowning looked more impressive from the outside. The breathing version was quiet, internal, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But it was the only version that felt true, and Marvin was tired of feeling anything else. He drove home through empty Detroit streets, past Hitsville and the Motown offices, the melody still in his head. And sometimes on nights when the fear got too loud and the expectations got too heavy, sometimes those four notes were enough to remind him why he'd sat down at the piano in the first place. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just to say something true in a room full of people who'd spent the whole evening saying things that weren't. That was the difference Marcus had seen but couldn't name. That was the reason Berry would spend the next decade trying to package Marvin's truth into something commercially viable. It could only be heard if you were listening for it, and most people weren't. They were too busy watching his hands, measuring his performance against some invisible standard of greatness. But greatness looked less like Marcus's virtuoso performance and more like four simple notes played with enough honesty to make a room stop talking. Not because they wanted to, but because something in those notes demanded it. The melody was still in his head when he pulled into his driveway, still there when he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, still there when he finally fell asleep just before dawn. It would always be there, that simple phrase, A reminder of the night he'd answered a challenge he hadn't wanted to accept, and discovered that the hardest thing about being Marvin Gaye wasn't the performing or the recording or the endless pressure to be something he wasn't. The hardest thing was knowing that he could play like that, could access that kind of truth, and still having to wake up the next morning and pretend it was enough to be the smooth romantic singer Motown needed him to be. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But on that night in Berry Gordy's living room, for 90 seconds or maybe 2 minutes at most, it had been exactly what it needed to be. And Marvin held on to that feeling like a life raft, knowing that someday he'd need to remember what it felt like to play something true in a room full of people who were expecting something else entirely. Someday he'd build an entire album around that feeling. Someday he'd find the courage to stop giving them what they expected and start giving them what they needed. But that was years away, buried in a future he couldn't see yet. For now, there was just the memory of 4 notes and the quiet knowledge that being good at something and being true to something weren't the same thing at all. And Marvin, lying in the dark, chose truth. He would choose it again and again over the years that followed, even when it cost him everything. Because that night at the piano had taught him that the only performance worth giving was the one where you forgot about the audience entirely and played like you were the only person in the room, even if it meant spending the rest of your life trying to disappear.